Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. I am Saurabh Todi and I have with me my colleague Shambhavi Naik. And we are going to discuss today a very interesting discovery that has been reported in Nature magazine, which discusses this idea that environmental DNA, which means the DNA fragments, pieces which are found in our environment. It could be, of microorganisms, humans, animals, plants, whatever. These DNA pieces or fragments are found in the environment. And the discovery is special because it shows that the human DNA segments can sustain in the environment for a much longer period of time, from like a few days to like years, decades, if not centuries in some cases. And what are the consequences of this discovery? So, for example, if you have DNA in the ice cores, those DNA would remain for a very long time. So, welcome, Shambhavi.
Thanks, Saurabh. Yeah, this is quite an interesting new addition to what we can do about DNA, right? So I think, like you said, DNA can stay in the environment for a long time. It is pretty stable. I think what the new thing that paper adds is that now you can take DNA from the air. So till now, we have been able to take, obviously, DNA from humans, DNA from substrates. You will see all of these crime thrillers where you will have a fingerprint or you will have a hair and they will like, we found the culprit, right? A bit of science fiction there. I wish biology worked as beautifully as it does in crimes and thrillers. But still, the idea that we can now take an air sample and be able to extract human DNA out of it and sequence it, I think is very fascinating. When once honed, I think it can have tremendous impact, both positive and negative on things that we can do with that DNA. And which is why, again, I think policy and regulation is going to be very important. So what the authors of that paper did was that they took air samples from a room which was frequented by a bunch of people. They then took the DNA out of the air, sequenced it back to the people that they knew were frequenting the room. They had researchers walk on a sandy beach, and they took DNA out of the sand prints and found and could relate it back to the researchers, right? And not just like fragments of DNA, they could identify ancestry. They could identify genes which were predisposing some of the researchers to certain diseases like cancer. So it is not just that we could sequence a ATGC out of thin air. We could actually get actionable information from this DNA. And I think that is going to be a huge game changer when we look at, say, health insurance, when we look at forensics, when we look at disease surveillance, right? And I think the human angle is special for us, but they were routinely doing this to track sea turtles, endangered sea turtles, to see if they were they were on the beach or something like that. So the idea that we can now look at other microorganisms, look at antimicrobial resistance, for example, growing up, or look at novel pathogens that we have not found by simply sequencing DNA from the air, I think is going to be stupendous. And I think we need to be more proactive in how we create regulation around this.
That is surprising, interesting, but also scary, because the idea that, usually it is understandable. Especially through, the crime shows that, okay, you go to a crime scene, you pick up fragments of DNA and you try to sequence it and you try to see, link whether the person was there or not. But now, as you say, that if it is possible that this technology has become so advanced and so intrusive that you can figure out ancestry and or disposition to cancer or any other disorders, that creates a lot of, I think, gray area as well. Would you say it is far-fetched to assume that this kind of technology or this aspect could be used in a way that can be very detrimental to the interest of the people by big companies? Let's say pharma companies or insurance companies. Do you see that there is some potential for that?
I do. I think what a likely scenario in my head, and we still might be a few years from actually reaching this, right? But A lot of health insurance companies, for example, are becoming more and more aware that there are genetic predispositions for certain diseases, and they might not protect or offer protections against known genetic predispositions, right? But SARS, a detailed molecular DNA test, they might not be aware, even people might not be aware of their genetic predispositions to certain diseases, right? Now, what you can do is basically you can call a person to an office, say, hey, we want to discuss health insurance with you, pick up the A sample, and sequence the DNA, right? Particularly for, the problem also is that this progress is not happening in silo, right? There are so many other advances that are happening. For example, India is trying to develop this Indian genome, right? Where we are trying to identify whether certain communities have predisposition to certain genetic diseases because they have been endogamous for such a long time. And so you already have, once you're actually interviewing a person or speaking to a person about health insurance, you already have a certain amount of background information. The more we do studies, the more we find out the exact contribution a particular mutation plays to a disease, the more confidence we can have in saying that, hey, if you have this mutation and this is your rest of your lifestyle, then this is the likelihood of you getting that disease, right? And once you put all of that together, you can imagine that if a person doesn't know they have a genetic predisposition, but now the health insurance company knows because they invited them over, looked at their DNA without the person knowing that they've given their sample because the sample was taken from air, the insurance company can actually make informed decisions on premiums, etc., while invading the client's privacy, right? And the client might not even be aware. So if I'm giving a sample, everybody knows that I'm giving a sample to look at X and Y disease. And if I have a predisposition, this is the way it impacts my premiums. I think that is still a fair kind of process. But to be able to do that without the client's knowledge and without recourse to justice in that case is, I think, a very scary proposition and something that we need to kind of understand how we regulate against. We obviously, I mean, the data privacy law is something that we have been speaking about for years now. That, whenever the context of using DNA technology comes, we always said that we need the right to privacy and the proprietary nature of a person's DNA, but we don't seem to be getting anywhere closer with that either. So in the absence of that, how some of these technologies will be used is going to be very critical, and how we regulate it and what is allowed.
Yeah, I mean, true. I think this is like this intersection of, how the policy has to be proactive, because there are, I mean, already, I mean, at least in advanced economies where, this kind of a system is a lot more developed, where there has been accusations that, insurance companies or health providers like go to like long lengths to, like find out whether a person is predisposed to some disorders, and then it affects their premium amounts, or like whether something is covered under insurance or not. So even if it is not a very obvious and clear use of this technology like by a company, it could be used as like a roundabout way to figure out. So like the policy interventions, I'm assuming, have to be proactive, where like for example, like there are certain cases which you're not allowed to, like certain disorders you're not allowed to kind of exempt due to the pre existing disorders. So to be able to include some of these genetic disorders, or at least to make sure that any of this information is through informed consent and not through any other means. So all of these would have to be very, very carefully studied, and I think regulators in India, I mean, have to be very careful and have to be proactive.
Right. I mean, I can also, I mean, diseases, I think, is something we can all understand and digest, I think, much easier. But think about this, like science at the other end of the spectrum also says that there might be genes that drive aggression, right? And there are mutations which make people more aggressive. We know this. We don't know to what extent. We know also that the person has more control over aggression than just what the genes provide. But there has been some research that shows that there are certain genes which are linked to aggression. So as a recruitment company, I could be screening people for aggression, right? I don't want overtly aggressive people in my organization. If I was part of some mercenary group, I would be screening for aggression because I want people who are more aggressive. And so those kind of things might also creep up. We don't know the extent to which, once the knowledge of DNA is understood, how far people might use it, especially given the ease with which we can now do some of these techniques, right? So DNA sequencing, for example. We discussed this on a podcast a few weeks ago, that something that costed $3 billion to start off with now costs $100 to $1,000. and it will only just continue to get cheaper and cheaper. So it's going to be very interesting on how DNA will be used. And I think the idea that you can now take it without somebody's understanding is going to be a fascinating game changer.
Yeah, I mean, that is a very, I think, important aspect of what we are discussing today, because these concerns regarding, like people or organizations using DNA to profile individuals, I mean, this concern has been there as for as long as we've been able to sequence DNA. But the idea now that, there is not an active participation of the individual in at least giving their sample itself is a very kind of, and it's also not a something that, okay, you go somewhere or something. If we been able to, if it is possible to just, extract the DNA from the environment, you don't even know, I mean, where you go, where you don't go. I mean, it's fascinating. At the same time, it's quite scary. And for example, I mean, if we shift towards, like how this can be used, let's say in a setting of like crime scene, like in forensics, for example, there has been increasing kind of like push by the government to, like improve the quality of forensics in India, and for like courts and the government and police and then law enforcement apparatus to be more, scientifically oriented in their investigation and to deploy the latest forensic tools. Do you see that, like, what kind of risks do you see of such technology for that purpose, especially given that like this technology and its consequences and its ups and downs are not very well known to both the public, the investigating agencies, and even judges?
Right. So this, I think, is this fascinates me the most because I've been working on this DNA technology use and application regulation bill that the government had introduced back in 2019. This is a bill that basically regulates the use of DNA technology in forensic use in India. The bill has been in various forms, been around since 2010, I think, or 2007, when the first iteration ever came up. DNA is used in forensics in India. This is under the IPC and CRPC, I think, not IPC. What this bill changed just was the idea of standardizing the kind of sample collections that we do, and then creates a database in line with databases that exist in the US and UK, where you have all criminal DNA, identifiers in a central database, so that you can then go back to another crime scenes and check if that person was present at that crime scene. So it is basically used in catching repeat criminals, and that's where its USP lies. Our bill also says that the database has 5 indices. It has suspects, it has criminals, it has known offenders. It also has something known as the site index, which is basically all the DNA which was picked up at the crime scene. Right? It's a crime scene index. And we had continuously argued, a bunch of us, that we don't need to put in all the DNA that you find at a crime scene in a database permanently, because, DNA stays for long, like we said before, right? So I could go into a hotel room, I could have lunch at a restaurant, and the next day there might be a murder at that restaurant, but my DNA might be around because I was in that room the day before, and I might have left it on the chair, I might have, my hair might have fallen somewhere. And just because my DNA is at the crime scene doesn't make me the criminal, right? Yet the idea was to put this DNA into a database, and the only way you can actually remove your DNA from the database is by writing to the magistrate that through the magistrate that we want our record stricken, right? But I have no idea that there is a crime that took place at that restaurant after I visited, and that the authorities have no idea.
Like, how would I know? Like, do I go and like search like my DNA? Like, okay, is it somewhere? Like, how would you know?
You don't know. And even they wouldn't know because they can't identify the DNA, right? Because they don't have the identifying match. So they just have a bunch of DNA sitting in a database. And suppose sometime in the future I go and actually commit a crime, and then they get hold of my DNA because I have committed a crime, then they can go, or I was in a place where, they have an accident has happened, and then they have said, okay, you are part of the suspects or whatever, you give your sample. Then they can go back and check and say, oh, Shambhavi was also at the crime scene. Right? I might not have been at the crime scene. I was at the place where the crime took place.
So you'll be implicated in that crime as well.
Right. Exactly.
I mean, it's funny, but it's scary. Like
it is scary, right? And so for the longest time, we've been arguing with the government that you shouldn't be hanging on to people's DNA without people knowing, right? Until now, the conversation was about, sample from, like knives and shirts and substrates that are present at a crime scene. How can you imagine? You take DNA from the air.
Yeah, I mean, it's also a kind of a nightmare for the investigating agency. I mean, let's say the kind of crime happened in a mall, right? It's like a shopping mall.
Hmm.
Like hundreds of people go through the environment every day, and thousands, not hundreds. And yeah, I mean, it's just very. So I mean, has there been any progress on that front? Like, is this clause still part of the bill,
So
or
the standing committee has submitted a report. The bill has not come up for discussion again. So
Mhm.
we don't know whether the clause of the bill will stay or not. But I think the other point that you're talking to, I think that's important, is we still don't know with what fidelity we can actually look at environmental DNA and tally it back to people that we don't know of, right? So the paper, obviously, they looked at researchers whose DNA they already knew, right? If you have a unknown sample, we don't know with how much fidelity we can actually go back and say that, hey, this DNA belongs to one person, this DNA belongs to another person. But again, I think it's a matter of time. I think if the field picks up demand, then obviously there will be a huge amount of progress that we'll make in trying to figure this out.
Stay tuned to All Things Policy. We'll be right back after a short commercial break.
And I think the other problem that stems from this idea that you can now look at DNA from crime scenes is that we have had judgments where people have said, hey, we found your DNA at the crime scene, which means you have committed the crime. And that I think is scary. The lack of understanding about the technology, about the probability of finding someone's DNA and what that means. A, what that means when you find a sequence that it actually belongs to a certain person, and B, that the certain person was present at the crime scene and committed the crime. Those are huge leaps of faith. And yeah, at times it just doesn't make sense. Yet, because a lot of times judges are not well trained enough to understand how DNA technology works, we have actually seen a couple of cases where people have said, the DNA is present, science says so, science cannot be wrong, which means you have committed the crime. And so, as the technology progresses, I think what we really going to require is much more training, much more understanding, much more awareness among people about their own rights, right? About right over their DNA. This was something else that we argued also for when we were looking at the DNA bill. So the DNA bill obviously allows officers to collect samples from persons with consent, except in a certain number of cases if the punishment of the crime is above 7 years. And our argument was like, under a huge ambit of law, so from Motor Vehicles Act to Medical Termination of Pregnancy Act, everything is subsumed within offences under which police officers can collect DNA. And our question was, but the person who we are collecting from, does he know the value of the DNA? Because if they don't understand why they have a right over their own DNA or how DNA can be misused, then people will just say, "Ha, okay, we will give samples," right? So we need that awareness, and that has to be a part of our policy. Is that we have to generate more awareness on the lucrative uses of DNA and why you should not be just handing it over. One of the things that gets very routinely discussed under the bill is the right to self-incrimination. So you have a right to not self-incriminate. And there was an old judgment in the UK which basically said that giving your DNA sample does not go against that principle. But still, I think awareness, is very critical on when and why you should be given a DNA sample.
So yeah, I mean, I think especially, I mean, in the context of what you said regarding training of judges, I mean, there has been a sustained push, in recent years by the government and law enforcement agencies to, increase the quality of forensics, to improve, like these tools that are deployed for this purpose. So as we are seeing higher and higher use of these technologies such as DNA fingerprinting, if there is not a corresponding increase in training of judges, it becomes extremely difficult, because as you said, I mean, the fact that the DNA was present at the crime scene is not at all indicative of the level of involvement of that individual in the crime. And I think one of the culprit in a lighter vein are the crime shows, right, where which is like, okay, we found this DNA, aha, you are the culprit, like the case is solved. It is not like that. And especially, I mean, for example, there have been many, like, I think this has become like, there has been more awareness on this, is that even when you find a piece of DNA, like which you can say it is of like a person X, it is hard to establish whether it is of person X or not, because again there are only certain regions of DNA which can differentiate between human beings. It is not required that, I mean, it is not a given that that fragment will be found similar for, like siblings or like twins, or stuff like that. So it's very complicated, and I think there needs to be a lot of, like cross communication and collaboration between the scientific community, law enforcement agencies, and judiciary to ensure that this does not become like a tool which is used too harshly, and like there is a significant denial of justice. So would you say that kind of like awareness program for judges is something that is like very important?
It is, and US, for example, had a judiciary training program, and they had given costs, included in their bill when they passed it, on how much every improvement in the technology should result in a corresponding training for judges. And they had a financial component which was included in it. I think that is very important. Our bill does not have that. It was an argument that I had presented to the Parliamentary Scientific Committee as well, that we need to have a component for training judges, and that some of the funding that the bill had asked for should be sent for judicial training. So it is, I think, going to be extremely important. Going forward. Again, the use of DNA is not new. It has happened for many, many years. But as it gets more recognition, as the technology becomes more complicated and technical to an extent, we are going to need more training.
Yeah, I mean, especially, I mean, for example, there's this new recent National Forensics University, So in such institutes, to have like a established kind of a department or like training program where, in the corresponding use of new technology, the pros and cons, the different aspects of it, those need to be, like made part of the core curriculum. And I think this idea that science is not fail safe, right? It is a tool that will be helpful in making a informed judgment, but relying blindly on these tools are also not a recipe that is right. One last question. So this idea that DNA is your private information, and it is something that people should be careful about not to distribute around. But would you say that the kind of public perception and the legal evolution of this would be very similar to what was there for fingerprints, right? Before, it was very unique. It was not something that was taken. I mean, in some parts of the world, even now, I mean, it is your signature is your fingerprint, and your fingerprint is as unique as your DNA. I mean, in a very simplistic way. So, would you say we might also see an idea of how private DNA is also evolve as the technology becomes more accessible? It becomes much more easier to sequence DNA. Now there are like technologies where you can synthetically like build a DNA in a lab to use it as a fragment to be used in a gene editing experiment. So do you see like this also changing over the years?
I think our readers are going to think about that the two of us are in some dystopia or utopia, depending on their point of view, and be like, what are these two thinking about? I think that the key difference between your DNA and your fingerprint is that your fingerprint tells a lot about your own identity. Your DNA can tells more than just your own identity, right? Obviously health and ancestry and all of that, but it can also be used to make inferences about your family and disease prevalence, say, in your family. It has been used before for forensics. It has been used to catch criminals because somebody else's data showed up, your first cousin's data showed up in a data bank. So that way, I think in that way, DNA is a little bit more communal than just being a privacy issue. I think that's where also the greater responsibility comes onto us, that we have to treat it as data that belongs to the people, not to government or private agencies. And I think that there are a lot of debates going on, particularly about this, right? So when you give your DNA, say, to Ancestry.com or 23andMe, what happens to that DNA? What other inferences can they make? Can they make inferences about my family, which is the most scary part? Should they? So I think the evolution will probably follow fingerprint, but it has to be a bit more nuanced than that. And the other thing I think is, which is important, is that we still don't know everything that the DNA has hidden from us, right? There are tricks and secrets of the DNA code that we are still trying to find out, and we don't know what in 5 years time we will find out, right? You might find the gene for intelligence. I don't think one exists, but you might think this kind of configuration has a stronger correlation. and you don't know what else we can find out from the DNA, and if we do, how it can be misused. And so any governance right now has to be ready for that future.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. And I think we have to be a bit more forward looking. It sounds very dystopian. I mean, I am in one way very excited to see how far the technology has evolved and how it can be helpful. At the same time, if not regulated properly, it could be very detrimental to both the technology, the public acceptance of it, and to the rights of like the people and the extent to which the state can be intrusive. So that's the time that we have. Thanks a lot, Shambhavi. And hopefully we'll talk next time when there is hopefully a DNA technology bill is passed and we can talk about how nice it is. Hopefully.
Yes, hopefully. Thanks. Thank you all for listening.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.